Hello, and welcome to the Gen X Dad and his Gen Z Teens podcast. This program takes a lighthearted look at generational differences about all sorts of topics. We explore everything from pop culture to history to relationships to politics, but only at a very shallow level. We don't aim to be controversial or be the authoritative voice on any topic. We are not social scientists or scientists of any sort for that matter. We are just here to rap about things that we think are important and that we will have fun talking about. Also, it is my opportunity to publicly and on the record prove that I am right and my teens are wrong in all cases and that the 80s and the 90s were absolutely the best time to grow up. So, without further ado, our topic for today is political issues. So, what does that mean? Basically, we're going to discuss major political issues of the 80s and 90s for myself and what I remember, and talk a little bit about my teens' political issues that come up in their daily lives, if any. We're going to do this with a pretty broad brush. I'm mainly just going to talk about what was important to me as a teen and what I was paying attention to, versus some sort of definitive voice of what actually was happening at certain times. This is not meant to be a deep dive, nor am I the definitive voice of my generation. Same goes for my teens. Whatever they say is, just their opinion of what their daily life is like, not that they are the, again, definitive voice speaking for all of Gen Z out there. That being said, I wanted to talk about this because the media does paint Gen Z as, in certain ways, more politically connected. I have a theory about why that is. And, what seems to be, if anything, important to them. My teens, I would say, are your average teens out there. And so while it's easy to paint a broad brush, especially older generations towards younger generations, to really just paint younger generations as one thing and just stereotype them. Clearly that's not true. We didn't appreciate that when we were growing up, and it'll just be interesting to hear from them. So with that, what do I remember? So first off, I can tell you, we got a daily newspaper at my house. I really don't remember reading it, certainly not on a daily basis. As far as evening news programs, I really didn't watch a lot of that. I thought most of them were boring. I had shows that I watched maybe after school, before the news programs came on, and then waiting for the evening for, sitcoms or, dramas that we were following or whatever was playing. I don't really remember watching the news that much. And then this is certainly days before the internet. So newspapers were really foundational, and then maybe news programs on the radio, but I certainly wasn't listening to anything like NPR growing up. So I can say I think I was a typical teen of the time, not super connected. That being said, I certainly, and maybe it's just with a little bit of hindsight, but it was such a big deal, was I'm a Cold War kid. And that is what I remember, was that every single issue seemed to go through that lens. And we certainly all lived with the possibility of there being a nuclear exchange. That could be over anything. The Berlin Wall was still up. The Warsaw Pact still existed. I was born after the Vietnam War, but a lot of those veterans were still around, as well as my grandparents who were World War II vets. Those are real things that we were dealing with. And then in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, being president, brought a new emphasis to the military and the growth of the military. And it was just such a big deal. The other big things going on were 1980, just the Olympics in general, were always cast as a East versus West. Medal counts were political. And then in 1980, the Soviets boycotted the Olympics. In 1980, we boycotted the Moscow Games. And then in 84, the Soviets and most of the Warsaw Pact boycotted the LA Olympics. And that was just such a big deal. Pop culture-wise, especially movies. You had the Rocky movies, which had Rocky Fight, one of the a Soviet. You had the Rambo movies, which after the first one, the sequels were certainly very Cold War-ish. You had a very popular Red Dawn movie with the invasion of America that as a teenager got you fired up to go out and be a guerrilla warfare person if the Soviets and Cubans ever invaded. James Bond movies, I mean, just inundated with this, East versus West. So crazy that I do remember that when the first Gulf War set off, like, it was out of my mind. I thought that if we ever went to war again, that we were just used to the Soviets being on the other side, and I was certainly nervous that the Soviets were going to go into Iraq to support them. Turns out they didn't, but that was a real and scary thing. And then shortly after that, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was just incredible. Actually, that might have happened just before the Gulf War. But either way, it was just a time that you just didn't think certain things that were possible until they literally were. And so I would just go on and say that everything went through that lens. That's what I remember. All political events were through the lens of the Cold War and how it affected our relationship and with our adversary, the Soviets. So along those lines, now as we get ready to turn over and start talking to the teens, I will give, certainly I guess millennials and Gen Z some credit because they certainly are more in tune. Now maybe it's because they're on their devices all the time, but you can't be on the devices without a degree of awareness of what is going on in the world as it gets pushed to you. And I do know both of them, my older teen certainly more than my younger teen, does go through and keeps up with certain news events of the day. And so I think overall they're more in tune with things than we were. But with that, let's just start out with the broad question. So the first teen, how much do you follow political events and how much of it affects your life in a daily basis, and just whatever that means?
I don't really follow anything too closely. A lot of what I do get is through social media or the internet or something, and just kind of stuff I happen to see. And I mean, mostly that is because one, I can't vote, and two, most of it doesn't really affect my life anyway. So there's just not much just not that interested because again, it doesn't really affect me. And I can't really affect it because I can't vote yet, so it's not a huge deal.
Kind of the same thing for me. Nobody that I know talks about that on a regular basis. I mean, can't vote. So and also I just don't really care that much.
Okay. You talked about social media, but what about just the internet? When you go on, do you just check generic news sites? Or I think, didn't you have something get pushed to you, some sort of news?
No, I don't really go to anything specifically unless it's for class or maybe if something does interest me and I want to look further, but most of the time it's just on social media or something.
Okay. Well, in that case, do you have friends that talk a lot about any particular issues?
Not mostly. It's just we just kind of aren't bothered or deal with that much. Just kind of do our own thing, which I think is pretty normal for teens of most generations.
Okay. I kind of thought it might go in this direction, but let's talk about specific issues then. When something big does happen, giant storm or whatever else, or let's start with something even more. How much would you say the environment is important to you?
I mean, obviously, it is important in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of us don't really bother ourselves too much with it because there's not a ton we can do. Obviously, as a generation and as like a group, I think we care a lot more than previous generations, but in terms of like individually, I don't really bother myself with it that much. I mean, until there's people who care that are actually in positions of power to change anything, it's not really anything I can do.
Yeah, nobody that I know talks about the environment. Of course, it matters, and we really only hear about it from like just having the news in the background or in class or at school or places like those. But otherwise, we don't talk about it, and I think it's gonna stay that way for a while because we can't do anything about it.
Okay. Wow, that's a little bit cynical. I will say this. One of the differences, generational, like we do recycling, and I think we're pretty good about it as a family. Growing up, there was really not a whole lot of recycling programs out there. So I think society has moved forward, and maybe what you guys think you're not doing, actually, just by participating in that, is actually better than what we did in the 80s and the 90s before a lot of places had. I mean, almost everywhere has some sort of recycling program now, and I think there's a bigger awareness of it. Okay, what about climate change as an issue? Is that something that you feel is important?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously definitely important, but I think um it's on kind of bigger people, governments and companies and stuff to kind of do it because they're the ones really making the issue. There's not a ton that us as individual people can do to kind of solve it on our own.
Okay. And again, this is an interesting thing. I mean, part of it is just awareness. As our family, I think, again, we try to do certain things that you guys have just grown up always doing and not realizing that it is not, or it is new. And then, I love my hybrid. So, all right. Global, like I talked about the Cold War. Do you guys feel from like a global political level, is there anything that concerns you just in the world? Like I grew up with a true, I wouldn't say anxiety, but there was certainly the way things were built up. I mean, we were aware of the Soviets and that we could go to war at any minute. Is there anything like that that you guys are concerned about on a global strategic political level?
No, I mean, not really. I don't think there's really anyone out there that's like a significant threat in any way or in anything like close to what it was like in the Cold War. I just think there's overall I don't want to say more peace, but like just not as much of a threat between like bigger kind of countries.
Yeah, there really isn't that much of like a competition between countries anymore, because with the Russia and Ukrainian war, I mean, you could tell that Russia was never really prepared for a war with the U.S. And plus, if we did go to war for some reason, I think it would be over pretty quick. Because I mean, without even really sending that much of a force there.
Well, as a former U.S. military guy, yeah, I do think we're stronger than everywhere else. However, that's actually where our nukes start coming in, is when a country feels an existential threat to itself. So I don't know. That's a difference between us. I'm having feelings again of certain Cold War levels where all of a sudden you go like, man, Russia, China, I could now see, whereas I couldn't maybe a decade or two ago, reasons for them to do anything nuclear-wise. All of a sudden, you can see that at least enter into the conversation again, which I think is uncomfortable. All right, last thing we'll talk about. We'll just broad brush paint this, okay? Because I don't really want to get into any one of these issues too deep. But let's talk just in general social justice, in all shapes and sizes, diversity, LGBT, just how much of that in your daily life. And I'll lead it off. Again, I grew up in the very small town, rural South, and actually I went to a Catholic school. So certainly none of that was out. Now, obviously, as a society, we've transitioned in a way that we've made it so people can come out and be who they believe themselves to be. But that was just not even something in the past. And so let's just talk about just in general, just social justice type things. How big a part does that play as an issue?
So normally, not really. We don't really talk about it, and the only time that it does come up in like a conversation with some of my friends, if it's like something big happens, like mainly just like something important, or I mean that's just really it. It doesn't come up that much.
I don't know. I think it depends a lot on the person. Some people definitely take it very seriously. And kind of consider themselves activists or whatever. But I think the vast majority of us just kind of go on with our lives. I think there's, or at least kind of that approach I take is, you do you, whatever. It's not really my business. So I think that's kind of how a lot of people treat it. It's, different than in the past where, people would have issues with people having certain lives. I think just a lot of us don't really bother with it. Like, it's not our business.
Okay, and that's fair. I think live and let live, sort of try to be the best in the golden rule, which is treat others how you hope they treat you. Fair enough. Okay, well, that's our first attempt at trying to weave through some of politics on how it might play out on the podcast. I want to thank everybody who listened today. Overall, what I'm taking away from this conversation is the 80s and 90s were much more intense and made for a stronger generation. I'm going to throw that out there. But I think you guys are so much more aware of what we were. So maybe we'll call it a draw for today. With that, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard or got something out of it, please hit a like. Tell your friends about it. Check out any previous episodes that are out there. And again, this has been Gen X Dad and his Gen Z teens. Look forward to our next episodes, and please continue to check back. We're trying to get them out each week. Thank you much. Have a good one.